Dov Zakhaim is a former Undersecretary of Defense in George W. Bush's administration and currently senior advisor at Center for Strategic and International Studies. Is now joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Zakhaim, thank you for making time for us and welcome. Some experts are saying the enemy is at the gate and that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has walked into Putin's trap. Your thoughts about that statement?
Well, I don't think it was a trap by Putin. Putin was caught by surprise and really didn't know how to react for almost 2 weeks. So it wasn't a trap. Russia's a very, very big country, and relatively speaking, taking part of the Kursk region isn't all that much. On the other hand, there are a couple of other indicators that show that maybe Zelensky wasn't making, and his high command weren't making that big a mistake. In the first place, they were being pressed already in the east, and they had to figure out a way to force the Russians to consider some kind of trade or at least sitting down to negotiate. They weren't succeeding just by holding the Russians back in the east. That just wasn't working. They got F-16s. The F-16s that they've gotten from America's European allies allows them both to pretty much dominate the skies right now and to hit targets on the ground and to go after the bridges that they knocked out. It's going to be much harder to build pontoon bridges, and those can be knocked out as well. The Russians have a problem there. And yes, they may be getting some territory back, at least they say so. The Ukrainians have a different story, which leaves the Belarus question, whether Lukashenko really wants to get involved in this fight is really uncertain. He's highly unpopular at home. He's probably in many ways the last real dictator in Europe. And if things went wrong for him, he'd be gone. So yes, they're building up. They're trying to draw troops away from Ukrainian troops away from the east. But remember too, the Russians have drawn troops down. They've taken some from Kaliningrad. They've taken some even from the Ukrainian front. So is this a gamble that'll win? Not clear, but is it a gamble that perhaps Ukraine had to take? Definitely, for another reason. Mr. Zelensky has no idea who the next president's going to be. And if the next president is Donald Trump, he's finished.
Mr. Zakhaim, some critics view the Kursk incursion has lifted Ukraine's hopes, but others expect a nightmare in Donbass for Ukraine. Is that the reality on ground?
Well, a nightmare would mean, of course, that all of Donbass falls to the Russians. It hasn't fallen in nearly 2 years, or a year and a half. The Russians might gain some ground, but how much is gaining ground? It's nothing like the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. So yes, the Russians may take 1 or 2 more cities, but the Ukrainians clearly are not lost there, and it's not obvious that Ukraine's going to be pushed out of Kursk. So yes, there are critics, but remember, these are the same critics who said that Ukraine would never attack Russia, and in fact, the United States has tried very hard to get them not to attack Russia. But other European countries, notably the Brits with Storm Shadow missiles, and the French have spoken about this as well. They're not holding the Ukrainians back, and there will be pressure on Mr. Biden to let loose and let the Ukrainians continue their attacks on Russia and to step up the support that we've been giving them, but far too slowly.
Mr. Zakhaim, for general knowledge purposes and briefly, why is Russia's Kursk region important for Ukraine?
Well, it's important for Ukraine because Ukraine will then have something that they can hold on to as possible negotiating bargain. There's also another reason, and I've written about this. Kursk was the locale of the greatest battle probably ever, certainly the greatest tank battle ever that the Soviets won, and it was the turning point for them, which led to their eventual occupation of Berlin. It's got huge psychological impacts on Russians, and particularly on Putin, who is a student of history. And so losing Kursk is a tremendous psychological blow to him. And that's why I think he hasn't been able to figure out how to react. So it's important for Ukraine, not only for strategic purposes, in order to offset what's going on in the east of Ukraine, but also for psychological purposes.
All right, I've been talking to Mr. Dov Zakhaim, who is a former Undersecretary of Defense in George W. Bush's administration and currently Senior Advisor at Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Zakhaim, as always, thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.